Let's be clear. There is not a single senator in this chamber on either side of the aisle who wants to ban IVF. All 100 senators, to the best of my knowledge, support IVF. Not a single one has called for banning it. And yet, I previously voted against the Democrats' partisan legislation because it's not an IVF bill. It's designed to backdoor and federalize broad abortion legislation, which I understand is the Democrats' partisan position, but it is contrary to the views of a great many Americans.
I'm sure that some of my colleagues will try to slink away from taking any accountability here. Per usual, they'll shout some ridiculous excuse like, this bill would allow for human-animal hybrids, as if anyone would ever believe that. And for the record, it would not. Or to those folks, I say that this afternoon's vote was your chance to put your vote where your mouth is. It was your chance to prove that you believe that every woman in this country deserves the chance to be called mom without also being called a criminal. Instead, your true policy beliefs, your hypocrisy, your misogyny showed through.
Mr. President, I am proud today to be joining my colleague from Texas in support of the IVF Protection Act. I am grateful to Senator Cruz for his leadership on this important topic. Both Senator Cruz and I are parents. We can both attest to the fact that there is no greater blessing in life than our children. For many Americans, building a family, becoming a mom or a dad, that's their American dream. IVF makes the difference in achieving that dream for millions of Americans who are facing infertility. IVF helps aspiring parents to start families, to grow their family. In the U.S., nearly 200 babies are born a day, so nearly 2% of all babies born are because of IVF. This treatment is really a game changer for so many families. That's why I strongly support continued nationwide access to IVF. IVF is legal and available from coast to coast in every single corner of America and in all 50 states. That includes my home state of Alabama, where Governor Ivey and the Alabama legislature acted quickly to protect IVF access. This is the bill that will give aspiring parents confidence and continued hope that their dreams of bringing life into this world can come true. Look, as I talk to families across Alabama and parents who are hopeful they can bring a child into this world, making sure that this process is protected and available is critically important. However, this bill isn't the one that Democrats are putting on the floor. This is not drafted in that way. It's drafted to be a partisan scare tactic, and what we're going to see today. For example, it's not written in a way to narrowly cover IVF. It includes completely separate treatments and technology, even including human cloning. Democrats are choosing to spread misinformation rather than fostering hope. The American people deserve better. The path forward is Senator Cruz and my IVF Protection Act.
I am an unequivocal supporter of protecting IVF. And I'm grateful that IVF has given so many parents struggling with infertility the gift of finally holding a child, a baby in their arms, finally having the opportunity to be a mother or a father and to raise a son or daughter and to give all of the love in a family that they so desperately want to give. Today, unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are staging an empty show vote on what they call an IVF bill in order to stoke baseless fears about IVF and push their broader political agenda. The partisan Democrat bill also deliberately overturns the conscious protections of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You know, it is unfortunate that Democrats have abandoned what used to be a bipartisan commitment to religious liberty, and they are now more than willing to overturn religious liberty protections. Instead of pushing a partisan and frankly cynical agenda, I invite my Democrat colleagues to actually do what they claim they want to do, which is work with me today and stand together to pass clear federal legislation protecting IVF. The show vote this afternoon is not about IVF, because if the Democrats wanted to protect IVF, this bill would pass 100-0 right now. What the show vote this afternoon is about is Democrats want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars running TV ads in an election season, falsely claiming that Republicans oppose IVF. So listen carefully. If you hear the words, "I object," from Senate Democrats, then you will understand the only reason that IVF is not protected with strong, ironclad protection in federal statute is because Senate Democrats cynically object to protecting IVF. And I would note to the members of the media who are writing on this, the Democrats are staging the show vote to get the headlines. They want you to write headlines, "Every Republican opposes IVF." Well, if you're going to write those false headlines, at least include the fact that today the Senate would have passed 100-0 strong, clear federal protection of IVF for every mom and dad, every parent in America, but for the fact that Senate Democrats cynically object while they claim to support IVF.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I have been perfectly clear about the glaring issue with this Republican bill. The cold, hard reality is that this Republican bill does nothing to meaningfully protect IVF from the biggest threats from lawmakers and anti-abortion extremists all over this country. It would still allow states to regulate IVF out of existence. And this bill is silent on fetal personhood, which is the biggest threat to IVF. It is silent on whether states can demand that an embryo be treated the same as a living, breathing person, or whether parents should be allowed to have clinics dispose of unused embryos, something that is a common, necessary part of the IVF process. Talk to the experts who provide this care. Talk to the families who are seeking it. And that question looms large in their minds. What are we supposed to do if our state says these embryos are living, breathing people? Do we have to do this process in another state? What is our legal risk here? That uncertainty is at the core of the chaos Republican bans have caused. The last time Republicans offered this hollow gesture of a bill, I asked the junior senator from Texas point blank, do you support letting parents have unused embryos disposed of? And a funny thing actually happened. He said on the floor, I'll answer that question, but he never did. He spoke about what the laws in some of our states are, but he never actually said what he supported. He never said what he believes should be federal law. He never mentioned that he once pledged to support a constitutional amendment to establish fetal personhood as the law of the land. So I ask all of my Republican colleagues once again, as a matter of national policy, should parents be allowed to dispose of unused embryos? If so, why is that key provision missing from your bill? Well, we all know why. And if not, how can you look the American people in the eye and say you support IVF? It doesn't compute. Thank you, Mr. President. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
So I would note there is one reason and one reason only that the Senate has not passed 100-0 a clear, unequivocal federal protection of IVF, because Senate Democrats cynically chose to object. Now, the senator from Washington raised all sorts of issues that are frankly red herrings. The issues she raised are current state law in multiple states, including Louisiana, including Missouri, including Georgia. And yet IVF is fully protected and available in those states. Senator Britt and I very consciously focused this bill on issues that could command bipartisan agreement. There is not a word in this bill that any senator, Democrat or Republican, disagrees with. Understand why the Democrats are objecting. The Democrats are objecting because they do not want to protect IVF in federal statute. It is cynical because we are 49 days away from Election Day, and they intend to try to scare voters in elections across the country by misleading the voters. I'll point out, at the same time that we have a presidential election, many of us served with the Vice President Kamala Harris. I remember Vice President Harris voting again and again and again against border security, against a border wall, and yet right now Vice President Harris is spending millions of dollars running ads with pictures of Donald Trump's border wall. It is deeply cynical, and it is because she is running away from her open borders record. The same is true here. The Democrats are going to spend millions of dollars arguing that Republicans are opposed to IVF and ignoring the fact that it is Democrats standing up and objecting that prevent it from being protected in federal law. The Democrats don't want to protect IVF because if we pass this law, you know what? They couldn't run their misleading campaign commercials.
If the Democrats sincerely want to pass a law relative to IVF, wouldn't they ordinarily work to have an amendment process where we can actually have debate and maybe achieve some consensus? It seems to me that by introducing a bill that they know is bound to fail and blocking the bill that you and the senator from Alabama have offered, that they are guaranteeing there will be no federal protection for IVF. Am I missing something?
As usual, my friend, the fellow senator from Texas, you're not missing something. That is precisely what's going on. This is not lawmaking. This is politics. This is partisan politics. This is an election campaign commercial that the Democrats are engaged in. And to make clear, Leader Schumer knows the result of the vote this afternoon. Why? Because we had the same vote just a couple of months ago. He knows exactly the result. Why are we voting on it again? Because they want reporters to write the same headlines again to deceive the voters. Again, I invite my Democrat colleagues, this should be an easy bill to support if, and this is a big if, in good faith you actually want to protect IVF legislation.
From the moment Donald Trump's MAGA Supreme Court reversed Roe, the hard right made clear they would keep going. As we saw earlier this year in Alabama, IVF has become one of the hard right's next targets. Today, Senate Republicans must answer a simple question. Do they support American families' access to IVF or not? If they support it, the only option is to vote yes on the Right to IVF Act. But if Senate Republicans vote no today and block IVF protections yet again, it will be further proof they stand against the well-being of families. If Senate Republicans vote no today, it'll be further proof that Project 2025 is alive and well when it comes to women's rights and reproductive rights as well. Republicans cannot claim to care about supporting families while voting against IVF protections. But that's precisely what they did 3 months ago. Today, Republicans get a second chance. Either stand with families struggling with infertility or stand against families and with Project 2025. Kudos and great thanks to Senators Duckworth and Murray and Booker and everyone who's championed this bill. Thank you to all my colleagues who have raised their voice on this most personal of issues. I urge everyone to vote yes. Ask for the yea. Right? And, Mr. President, I move to proceed to the motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture failed on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to calendar 413 S4445.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 44. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion upon reconsideration is not agreed to.
I come to the floor today to speak on the bill that recently failed, despite my colleagues' assertion that they support access to in vitro fertilization for all Americans. You know, this morning, I was able to pack my daughter's lunch boxes. It sounds mundane, I know, but when I spend just a second thinking about it, even that kind of everyday moment with my girls isn't mundane at all. It's a miracle, because after 10 years of struggling with infertility, after being wounded in combat, I was only able to have my two darling girls through the medical marvel that is in vitro fertilization. The only reason there are PB&Js for me to make for their lunch, the only reason there are teeny sneakers for me to Velcro clothes is because after I came home from war, I had the freedom to seek the health care I needed to make my dream of going from Tammy to mommy a reality. I was one of the lucky ones, because now that freedom to get reproductive care is at risk for millions of other women whose most desperate hope in the world is to have a little one of their own. Make no mistake, that isn't some future nightmare. This is our present reality. Countless women already had their IVF treatments interrupted this year after an Alabama State Supreme Court ruling painted women seeking fertility treatments as criminals. And in this perilous moment for our country, as we stare down November and all the uncertainties that come with it, there's no telling how many more will follow. Look, I doubt that Donald Trump even knows what the acronym IVF stands for, and half the time I wonder if he can even spell IVF. But despite the incoherent, delusional, and frankly embarrassing ramblings that came out of his mouth last week, the reality is that he is the reason that IVF is at risk in the first place. The Dobbs decision is what led us to today's nightmare, taking the power to decide how and when to start families from us women and handing it to politicians in state houses across the country. Donald Trump is the one who brags about taking down Roe. Donald Trump is the one who acts like that's something to be proud of. He's like a bank robber who steals cash out of the till and flees the scene and then still expects a reward for calling the police to report a crime. So while it may now be convenient for him to claim that his support of IVF is as huge as the made-up crowd sizes at his rallies, we know the truth. He is the reason that IVF is in danger. He is to blame. He and every other Republican who cares more about staying good with Trump than about doing good for the Americans they are supposed to be serving. Many, too many of those Republicans are in this very chamber. I know that because today marked the third time in the past 7 months that I've come to the floor begging my Republican colleagues to help me pass legislation I wrote that would protect every American's right to IVF, regardless of what state they live in. A bill that would ensure no doctor or hopeful mom could be criminalized for trying to start a family. One that would permit all health insurers to cover the treatments, and one that would require the federal health insurance plan to cover reproductive technologies, allowing our troops to preserve their sperm or eggs before deploying to a combat zone. When I tried to pass it in February, it took the junior Republican senator from Mississippi what seemed like not even one full Mississippi second to block its passage. Then, when I tried to pass it again in June, nearly every GOP member voted it down. Today, it was the same old cynical story as Republican after Republican voted no, no, no. And at this point, it's obvious. Despite whatever talking points they force through gritted teeth on cable news, when the rubber hits the road and the vote is called, Republicans would do anything to get out of actually passing legislation that would protect women's right to access reproductive health care. Women in this country have been through enough. What women don't need is a man who is found liable for sexual abuse controlling what we can or cannot do with our bodies. What we don't need are politicians who have sworn fealty to a convicted felon treating us like we're the ones who are criminals. It's tragic. Republicans only seem to care about protecting life when it supposedly consists of some cells in a medical lab freezer. But what about when that life is of fifth graders whose school day gets shattered by a man with an AR-15 who wants to turn their math class into a massacre? What about when that life is their neighbors who is yet one more woman to bleed out on the delivery table as the maternal mortality crisis among women of color rages on? Well, then those same Republicans couldn't seem to care less about defending the sanctity of life. I went to war to defend this nation's rights and freedoms. I did it because I believe so deeply in the importance of that mission. I wasn't asking my GOP colleagues to head into combat to show that they cared deeply too. I wasn't asking them to do anything hard at all, actually. All I was asking them to do was to simply support a bill that could have represented millions of women's only chance of starting families. All I was asking of them was to vote in a way that reflected the position they claimed to have when they were spouting talking points on Fox News. They couldn't even do that. So on behalf of every woman who has faced a heart-shattering struggle of infertility, all I can say to my Republican colleagues this afternoon is, shame on you.
Mr. President, today we once again attempted to move forward on the Right to IVF Act, and Republicans once again stopped us. Now let's remember a few things about how we actually got here, because it is infuriating. Republicans have tried to claim the right to IVF is not under attack, but it was Republicans' own votes that killed this bill. And it was the Republicans' own efforts to overturn Roe v. Wade and champion fetal personhood, which treats an embryo like a living, breathing person, that caused the chaos and uncertainty around IVF access, that caused women in Alabama to have IVF appointments canceled earlier this year, jeopardizing women's hope of growing their families and lighting on fire the thousands of dollars some of these patients spent ahead of treatment. And despite that hard lesson, to this day, there is still widespread Republican support for fetal personhood bills. To this day, Republicans own bills to supposedly protect IVF. They say nothing about fetal personhood and do nothing to make sure parents can dispose of unused embryos. Now, Democrats came forward with a bill that would actually protect IVF. Our bill, the Right to IVF Act, protects the right to IVF nationally, and it lowers the cost of IVF for families with stronger insurance coverage requirements. It also includes my bill to make sure more veterans and service members can access IVF services. And many of the same Republicans who have supported fetal personhood laws, the single greatest threat to IVF, are pretending this bill isn't necessary. Many of the same Republicans who are desperate to posture as pro-family and who constantly say they stand by our troops are saying we can't afford to help more military families get IVF. Funny how they're always game to shovel more money at tax breaks for billionaires, though, but I digress. Mr. President, Republicans voted this bill down again. They voted down protecting IVF again. They voted down making IVF more affordable again. They voted down helping service members and veterans grow their families again. And they did it fresh off another round of pretending to support IVF. They did it just as Donald Trump, the man who kicked all of this off, the man who proudly boasted that he ended Roe, is trying to say he's the leader on IVF. When Donald Trump says he is the leader on IVF, hear me on two things. First, he almost certainly doesn't understand what IVF is. Secondly, he doesn't understand what leadership is. You do not get credit for opposing a problem that you caused in the first place, especially when your party, the party you lead, won't let us solve it. The entire country just saw plain as day that Donald Trump is lying again and that nothing has changed for Republicans since they overturned Roe v. Wade.
Here, in this chamber, it's your vote that counts, not your tweets, not your public statements, not your TV interviews, your votes. And today, for the second time in 3 months, Republicans voted against protecting IVF. Some of them claim to support IVF. All of them profess to be pro-life. But given a chance to be both, they failed. Republicans are doing a lot of mental gymnastics to try to justify their cruel extremism on this issue. But let's be very clear about what the Right to IVF Act does. it protects every American's right to access IVF and lower the cost of treatments for families who need it. That means anyone struggling to start or to grow a family can undergo IVF without fear of interference or punishment by the government. And think about the fact that we have to make a law that says families should not be punished for trying to start a family. That's what this bill does. It says you should have access to this care and you cannot be punished for trying to start a family. It means providers can administer the treatment without worrying that they'll be thrown in jail or have their license taken away just for doing their jobs. And it means insurers can cover IVF without implementing absurd restrictions and onerous requirements that would make it all but impossible to access this miraculous treatment. What this bill is a common sense measure that is necessary precisely because of the environment Republicans created with the fall of Roe. An environment where over half of women of reproductive age in America now live in states that are hostile to abortion rights. And let's be clear, Republicans did that through their vessel of the United States Supreme Court. And so they can pretend to be for IVF, but vote against the bill that would actually protect it for good. They can pretend to be for life while also trying to restrict access to a miraculous treatment that creates life. They can pretend to have their own bill to support IVF when in fact that bill literally does the opposite. It literally does the opposite. Because here, it's your vote that counts. It is not your rhetoric. It is not your statement. It is not even your explanation. They voted no against IVF, and shame on them.
The senator from Washington.
I rise to join my colleagues and want to thank my colleague Senator Murray for her leadership on this important issue over many, many years. But I join my colleagues to say it's time to put partisan politics aside and stay out of family planning issues and leave that up to families in America. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle had an opportunity today to believe that women deserve the chance to start a family through IVF, the miracle for people who have been struggling with fertility challenges. In 2022, more than 2,000 new babies were born in the state of Washington, thanks to IVF. This is something we'd like to see every year, but as the court has struck down important issues and states have gone on various efforts to try to restrict women's access to health care and full reproductive care, IVF has even been questioned. Practically everyone knows someone who overcame the challenge, desperate to have a pregnancy and the sadness of infertility, and that's probably why 86% of Americans say that IVF should be legal. This afternoon, we voted on that right. The Right to IVF Act. That's what we were voting on, a straightforward vote, one of those that would just show the American people, the mainstream of America, that we agree with them. That's all we were trying to do, as people have punted around this very important right that now, because of actions by individual states, no longer seems to be guaranteed, and yet we all here could have cast a vote saying we wanted to protect it in voting for this act. It was an opportunity for us to ask our colleagues who previously voted against this measure to say that they actually agreed this time on IVF, to show that they mean what they say, not some version of a bill that basically curtails and makes it impossible for somebody to run an IVF organization. We have no time for that, no time for that. My colleagues' voting history shows that if you didn't support IVF before and you didn't support it today, I'm not sure what it is that you think you support.
For all their words, our Republican colleagues have acted today in a way that will speak for years and longer. It will speak to Lisa, a constituent of mine in Connecticut. And I asked my Republican colleagues to listen to Lisa in what she shared with me after the Alabama Supreme Court ruling and before she and her husband became parents to a healthy, happy baby girl as a result of IVF. She said, and I quote her, "If a woman is willing to go through the physical, emotional, and financial toll of IVF treatment to bring a new life into the world, you'd better believe she is going to love that baby more than anything one can imagine. And we need more love like that in the world." For Lisa, that Alabama Supreme Court ruling banning IVF treatment was, quote, heartbreaking and infuriating. Families like Lisa's wouldn't exist if it weren't for IVF. I asked my Republican colleagues to listen to Kim and Tina, who were married in 2013 and immediately knew they wanted to start a family in Connecticut. As a gay couple, they needed to rely on reproductive technology, and they were forced to meet standards that their straight friends never encountered. And IVF worked for them. They're now proud parents to twins, whom they call, quote, the greatest gifts of our lives. Interested in politics and government, trumpets and sailing, their gifts to the community, their friends, and their school. Listening to parents who have gone through the heartbreak and pain of infertility and who have found this miracle of IVF is not limited to Kim and Tina and Lisa. It is all of America who knows these stories in their own lives. Every American knows a couple that has tried year after year. And finally, if they are really lucky and can afford it, discovers the miracle of IVF. Very simply, every one of those families, every American ought to have access to that miracle of life. And yet, our Republican colleagues, even though their own constituents would tell them, if they were listening, about the reasons why IVF should be protected, have acted today, despite their words and their rhetoric, to block IVF protection. This scientific miracle is so immensely important, it ought to be non-political, non-partisan, non-controversial. There ought to be unanimity. And this vote is the second one. I believe in second chances. If we had wanted to be strictly political about this bill, we could have said, well, no second chance here. We're going to take you on that first vote because that would be the one politically advantageous. We gave them a second chance to get right on IVF, and they refused. I'm angry. I'm disgusted. Most important, I'm sad. Because this vote was an opportunity to tell American families, we're with you. We stand with you. We know how physically painful IVF is. We know how emotionally painful infertility can be. We know how great families want to build greater families with children who will serve our country, make it greater. The callousness and cowardice of our Republican colleagues speaks louder than words. And this vote will haunt them. It will haunt, at the very least, their consciences, or it should. We have the courage to stand with the American families who need and deserve IVF. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I'm so grateful to be here with colleagues who care deeply about protecting our reproductive freedoms and supporting families all across America. And I want to thank Senator Patty Murray, who's been our leader on this for many years. And it's just incredible to me that in 2024, we are standing here even having to talk about this. It's really incredible. And I just want to take us back a bit, because this Congress, Republicans have had 16 chances to protect reproductive freedom. Over 16 chances. And every time they have voted no. So today, once again, they block a bill to protect access to IVF for thousands of American families. Now, we had this vote before, and then the former president said he changed his mind. And he wanted to make IVF free. And he wanted to force insurance companies to cover IVF. And we thought, well, that's great. Let's come together in a bipartisan way to be able to move forward and protect this really important part of reproductive freedom. So we bring the bill up again. Now, I assumed that the former president was on the phone all last night calling our colleagues, calling all of our Republican colleagues. I mean, like he did for his effort to block and kill the bipartisan border security bill when he wanted to make sure that didn't go forward and he had an issue to run on. He was burning up the phones. Well, given what he said to the American people about his now support for IVF, I assume he was burning up the phones last night. Well, if he was, it wasn't very effective, and Mr. President, we know he wasn't. We know when he really wants something, what he does. When he really wants something, he's calling the Speaker of the House to say, don't support a bipartisan bill to continue the government, shut it down. But I bet there wasn't one phone call made last night to support this effort to protect a woman's reproductive freedom and the freedom of families to grow their families. Since the fall of Roe, Republicans have continued their assault on reproductive freedom. IVF, questions about birth control, of course, abortion access, and there are a whole range of privacy questions for women in terms of what happens during their pregnancies. We know that IVF is about allowing the freedom to have children. You know, if you struggle with infertility, it gives you a way, an effective way to start or grow a family. It's helped thousands of American children, including my friend Ellen, who now has a beautiful little boy, Carter. Just had his first birthday party not long ago. I mean, how could you not love that face? Carter is incredible. And we are all so excited for Ellen and for Carter. That's the miracle of IVF, Mr. President. IVF has also helped Brittany from Holly, Michigan, start her family. After being diagnosed with PCOS at 16, she experienced fertility issues when she was ready to start a family. After 3 years, 6 rounds of fertility treatments, countless tests and 2 rounds of IVF, she gave birth to her beautiful baby girl, Eloisa, who's now 11 months old. What a blessing. Despite the strain this journey put on her relationships, Brittany told me that every penny was worth it. Every penny was worth it for our daughter. IVF has made our family complete. And she's not the only Michigander who's been able to start a family because of IVF. When her husband was serving our country in the U.S. Navy, Sue from Brighton, Michigan, used IVF to bring her son into the world. At the time, she was an elementary school teacher, and her husband was deployed for months at a time. Her entire salary went towards the 7 rounds of IVF that were needed to have a successful pregnancy. With insurance only paying for some of the medication, she spent over $100,000 out of pocket on treatment to be able to have that baby. This journey put an emotional and financial strain on Sue and her husband, and that is certainly not surprising. And this situation is not unique. Our veterans and service members sacrifice so much for our country. They shouldn't have to sacrifice their ability to start or grow a family because these treatments aren't covered, and politicians tell them they don't have that choice. And families shouldn't have to choose between going into debt to cover the enormous cost of treatment and having a baby just because it's not covered by insurance. That's why voting for the Right to IVF Act was a no-brainer for me. We need to protect this freedom, access to this opportunity for families. We need to expand and protect fertility treatments for our service members and our veterans, and cover adoption assistance. We need to cover and lower the costs of IVF treatments for all. We need to make sure women have the freedom to make our own reproductive decisions, not right-wing politicians, not judges. When I hear the former president say, this is all about sending the decision back to the states rather than the federal government. No, this is about having individual women and their families make the decision. It doesn't matter if it's a federal politician or a state politician. The point is there should be no politician. It should be the woman and her family making those decisions, the woman herself making that decision about what will happen for her. So that's what we're fighting for, and we're not going to stop fighting for that. In America, we had that freedom for over 50 years, and it got ripped away by Donald Trump and the appointments he made to the United States Supreme Court. And now it's just unleashed all kinds of harm, all kinds of damage for women and death because of the fact that some folks that think they can control women's lives. I'm incredibly disappointed that our Republican colleagues did not join us today in protecting this important freedom. Thank you, Mr. President.